Duke's paws hit the marble like they'd been welded there. Officer Mitch Greer felt the leash go rigid in his fist, then heard the growl start low in the Belgian Malinois' chest. Not aimed at a person, but at a brown leather messenger bag propped against the courthouse wall. "Move, buddy," Mitch whispered. Duke didn't blink, and upstairs, in less than 40 minutes, the man accused of killing Duke's old partner was about to face a jury for the very first time. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me what part of the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so stories like this one keep finding you. The fog had barely lifted off Hargrove County. Cedarbrook, Virginia was still that specific grey that only mountain towns get in early autumn, when the leaves haven't fully turned and the air smells like wet stone and diesel from the buses idling by the courthouse curb. Mitch had parked in the same slot Kyle Renfrew used to park in, space number 12, right beside the maple that was already dropping its first orange leaves. He hadn't planned it. His hands had just steered there. Duke was 7 years old, in the prime of his working life, and for 5 of those years he had climbed these same steps beside Officer Kyle Renfrew. 212 arrests, 3 department commendations, a bond so tight that clerks upstairs still told the story about the afternoon Duke had refused to budge from Kyle's side during a 3-hour deposition, lying flat on the marble with his chin on Kyle's boot, sighing every 20 minutes like he was personally offended by how long lawyers talked. Kyle had been dead for 7 months. Route 9 outside Cedarbrook, a routine stop for a broken taillight on a tan sedan at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The dashboard camera had caught the muzzle flash and nothing else because the angle was wrong, and Duke, who always rode in the back, had, for reasons no one had been able to fully explain, been left inside the cruiser with the windows up. Kyle had died on the side of the road with his hand still hooked on the door of the tan sedan. The driver, a 34-year-old contractor named Brian Kellner, had been arrested within the hour. The state had built its case on ballistics, on Kellner's proximity, and on a 911 recording in which a man's voice, allegedly Kellner's, could be heard shouting a threat about 2 minutes before the shot. That trial was scheduled to open at 9 sharp. Mitch was still crouched beside Duke when the first bailiff came out. His name was Ronnie Vassar, a broad, tired man who'd been working the courthouse door for going on 21 years, and he took one look at the dog and stopped dead. "He won't let me in," Vassar said, flat. "He won't let me move him either," Mitch said. "Well, we got about 35 minutes before Judge Maddox starts wondering why nobody set up his water pitcher." Mitch looked back at Duke. The dog's whole body was tuned like a wire. His nose was drifting in tiny, deliberate arcs, the pattern Mitch had seen 1,000 times in training. The pattern that meant Duke was locking on something specific in the air, not just a smell. A shape of a smell. "Ronnie," Mitch said, "tell them to hold everything. I'm calling the K9 supervisor." Vassar opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He'd been at Kyle's funeral. He'd seen the way Duke had walked up to the closed casket and refused to sit, refused to lie down, just stood there with his front paws on the runner for the entire service, tail lowered like a flag at half-staff. Vassar knew what a dog like Duke looked like when it had decided something. "All right," Vassar said. "I'll shut the front doors." He didn't. Not quite. What he did was step back inside and quietly ask the deputies at the metal detectors to start routing the incoming crowd around the east entrance. He didn't say why. He'd been in this building long enough to know that when a K9 locked up, you didn't announce it, you just moved people. A young man in a blue tie had been standing off to the left, halfway between the flagpole and the courthouse steps, holding a paper cup of coffee. He was maybe 26 years old, thin, clean-shaven, with a nervous habit of tucking his hair behind his ear, even though it was cropped short and stayed in place on its own. Mitch had clocked him because that's what handlers do, they clock everybody. The young man had walked up carrying the brown leather messenger bag about 15 minutes earlier, had set it down against the stone wall as if it was heavy, and had said, when a deputy passed by, that he was waiting on somebody from the defense team. Now the young man was still standing there, but he wasn't looking at Duke. He was looking at the bag. Duke's ears flicked once, forward, then locked. Mitch stood up slowly and shifted so that his own body was between the young man and the bag without seeming to. In his pocket, he pressed the button on his shoulder mic and murmured, "Central, this is Greer. I need Sergeant Delacourt at main entrance, Hargrove County, K9 alert, confidence level high, and keep the frequency clear." The reply crackled softly. "Delacourt is 2 minutes out." The young man in the blue tie shifted his weight. His right hand slid casually toward his coat pocket. Mitch let his palm rest on the grip of his sidearm without drawing it, the movement so slow it barely counted as a movement. Duke's growl notched up one hair, still not aggressive, just a warning that the wire was live. Judge Thomas Maddox came down the front stairs at 8:47, black robe already zipped, reading glasses in his hand, expecting a scene. He had heard through the courthouse grapevine, probably from Vassar, that something odd was happening at the door, and Judge Maddox was not a man who liked to have odd things happen in his building without laying eyes on them himself. He was 62 years old, silver at the temples, and had presided over the Hargrove County bench for going on 19 years. He was known for two things: for handing down sentences that made criminals swallow hard, and for being unable to walk past a stray cat without stopping. He recognized Duke instantly. 3 years earlier, Maddox had visited West Cedarbrook Elementary School for a Meet Your Community program, and Kyle Renfrew had been the K9 demonstration. Maddox remembered exactly the way the third graders had screamed with delight when Duke had sneezed on a boy's white sneaker, spraying it with what Kyle later described, deadpan, as expressive canine opinion. Maddox had laughed harder than the kids. Now he stood on the courthouse steps looking down at that same dog, and the dog looked back at him with the particular stillness of an animal that had already made up its mind. "Mitch," Judge Maddox said quietly, "Your Honor, how long has he been like this?" 15 minutes. He won't move for anybody, sir. He won't take a step." Judge Maddox glanced past Mitch to the young man in the blue tie, who was now standing very still, very upright, as though he'd been photographed. Then Maddox looked at the messenger bag. Then he looked at Duke. And whatever he saw in Duke's face made him take a slow, unhurried step backward and lift one hand, palm out, to the deputies flanking the door. "Gentlemen," Maddox said, "please clear the steps. We are going to allow the K9 supervisor to do her job." Sergeant Ada Delacour arrived 30 seconds later. She was a small, wiry woman with a graying braid down her back and forearms like braided rope from 28 years of working large dogs. She took one look at Duke's posture, at the way his weight had settled forward, the way his ears were pinned high but calm, the way his tail was low and still, and she read the situation without a single word being spoken. "Sir," she said to the young man in the blue tie, "please step away from the bag." The young man stepped back fast, too fast. His paper cup of coffee tipped and slopped a brown arc across the stone. He said something like, "It's not mine," but he said it too quickly and too loudly, and the deputy nearest to him closed a hand around his elbow in a way that was polite and completely unmovable. "Sir," Delacourt said again, calmer, "just to the side, please. Nobody's accusing you of anything yet. We're going to check the bag." Duke's tail moved for the first time in 20 minutes. One slow, deliberate wag, almost like a nod. The bomb tech came, then a second one, then a specialist from the district attorney's office who was there for the Kellner trial and happened to have a forensic tech in the parking lot. Within 12 minutes, the messenger bag had been photographed, x-rayed on a portable unit, cleared of any explosive threat, and then carefully opened on a folding table under a canvas privacy screen. Inside were 2 manila folders. Underneath the folders, wrapped tightly in a coiled cable sleeve, was a small, black, external hard drive. The kind you can buy at any office supply store for about $80. It had no label. It had no fingerprints on the case, which by itself said something, because a hard drive without fingerprints is a hard drive that somebody wiped down before putting it into a bag they intended to hand off. Duke had not once looked at the folders. His nose, from the moment he had planted himself in front of that door, had been aimed at the hard drive. Sergeant Delacour crouched by him and rested one hand between his shoulder blades and said, "Good boy, Duke. Good boy, brother. You got him." Duke leaned his head against her thigh, closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, and then opened them again. He wasn't done yet. Judge Maddox turned to the bailiff. "Ronnie," he said, "I am calling a recess before I have even called the trial to order. Get every juror routed to the back holding room. Keep them separated. Nobody enters or leaves my building through the front until I say so." "Yes, sir." Maddox looked at the young man in the blue tie, who was now standing very quietly between two deputies, all the color drained out of his face. "And you," Maddox said, not unkindly, "are going to spend a little time with our friends downstairs while we figure out what you were doing with a hard drive that a police dog just tried to arrest." The young man opened his mouth, closed it, and said nothing. His name, they would learn within 40 minutes, was Corey Underwood. He was a paralegal, 26 years old, employed for the past 14 months by the law firm defending Brian Kellner. Officially, his job was to carry evidence binders from the firm's office to the courthouse each morning of a trial. That was the job on paper. That was the job everybody in his firm believed he was doing. That was not the only job he was doing. The hard drive went into an evidence bag, into a labeled box, into the back of a state police cruiser, and 47 minutes later it was plugged into a forensic workstation at the Virginia State Police Digital Lab in Roanoke. A technician named Priya Delgado logged in, ran the standard right blocker protocol, and began pulling files. There were 3 folders on the drive. The first folder contained scanned copies of the discovery documents in the Kellner trial, nothing that shouldn't have been in a defense paralegal's possession. Boring, expected, procedural. The second folder contained personal financial spreadsheets belonging to a man named Ray Holden, Sergeant Ray Holden, Cedarbrook Sheriff's Department, Kyle Renfrew's shift supervisor at the time of his death. The third folder contained audio files. 2 of those audio files were labeled 911 call, Route 9 incident. One version was 14 minutes and 38 seconds long. The other was 12 minutes and 21 seconds long. Priya Delgado, who had spent 9 years listening to edited audio for a living, needed less than 5 minutes to identify the cut. 2 minutes and 17 seconds had been surgically removed from the middle of the recording. The version that had been submitted into evidence at Kellner's arraignment was the short one. The long one, the unedited one, was already on file with the phone carrier's server, and Priya Delgado had access to it, and when she played them side by side, she felt her stomach turn. In the 2 minutes and 17 seconds that had been cut out, a man's voice, clearly not Brian Kellner's, could be heard shouting at Kyle Renfrew, "You will not do this to me, Renfrew. I swear on my kids, you will not." And then after a pause, "Put your hand down." And then the shot. The voice on that recording was not Brian Kellner's. The voice was Sergeant Ray Holden's. Priya Delgado picked up her phone, called her supervisor, and said the sentence that starts more investigations than any other in her line of work. "Sir," she said, "you're going to want to sit down." Judge Maddox got the call at 10:22. He took the courtroom bench 3 minutes later. The jurors were still in the back holding room. Brian Kellner was in the defendant's chair, wearing a grey suit that didn't quite fit him at the shoulders, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist, because that was county policy for capital cases. His defense attorney, a heavy-set woman in her early 50s named Marissa Vance, was on her feet before Maddox had even sat down. "Your Honor, I'd like to know why my client's trial has been delayed by more than an hour without—" "Sit down, Ms. Vance." Vance opened her mouth. "I said sit down." She sat. Judge Maddox looked out over the courtroom at the small crowd in the pews, at the two reporters from the Roanoke paper, at Brian Kellner's mother in the second row with her rosary crushed inside her fist, at Kyle Renfrew's widow Elena in the third row with her hand pressed against her mouth, at the empty jury box, at Kellner himself. Then Maddox looked at Marissa Vance. "Miss Vance," he said, "I am suspending this trial. I am not continuing it, I am not recessing it, I am suspending it, and I'm ordering the immediate detention of your paralegal, Mr. Corey Underwood, and the immediate securing of every piece of digital evidence that has passed through your firm in connection with this case. I am also ordering the Office of the Commonwealth's Attorney to open a companion investigation into your firm's conduct." Vance's mouth opened again. This time nothing came out. "Do you understand me, counsel?" Your Honor, I need to know what—" "You will know what," Maddox said, "when I decide to tell you. For the moment you will surrender your phone to the deputy at the door, and you will not leave this building until my clerk has taken your statement. Is that understood?" Vance stood there a moment longer. Then she nodded, very slowly, and sat down. Brian Kellner was looking straight ahead, not at the judge, not at the jury box, not at his own lawyer. He was looking at a spot on the wall about 6 feet above the door, and his lips were moving, and he was saying very quietly, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Nobody in the courtroom knew yet that this was the first time Brian Kellner had allowed himself to believe he might not spend the rest of his life in a prison cell for something he had not done. And nobody in the courtroom knew yet that the man who had actually done it was, at that very moment, sitting in his own patrol cruiser 3 blocks away, drinking coffee from a thermos, listening to the police scanner. But Sergeant Ray Holden had heard the words, "Canine alert, main entrance." And he had heard the words, "Delacour on scene," and he had put down his thermos, and his hand had begun very slightly to shake. Duke was walked back to Mitch's cruiser after the scene cleared. His tail was low, but not from defeat, from the kind of tiredness a working dog gets after doing exactly what he was born to do. Mitch opened the back, and Duke jumped up, circled once, and lay down with his chin on his paws. Mitch stood there a moment with his hand on Duke's flank, feeling him breathe. "Kyle," Mitch said quietly to nobody, "your dog just started a war." He didn't know how right he was. The story of what actually happened on Route 9, on that Tuesday night 7 months earlier, was not the story anybody in Cedarbrook had been told. For 3 weeks before the traffic stop, Kyle Renfrew had been keeping a notebook. Not a work notebook, a personal one, red cover, the kind you buy at a grocery store checkout for $1 and change. In that notebook, in his neat block letters, Kyle had been logging things, small things, times he had responded to a call and found Sergeant Holden already there, times Holden had signed evidence out of the property room after hours, times a small quantity of prescription pills, oxycodone mostly, sometimes fentanyl patches, had gone missing from a case log without being noted in the disposal sheet. Times the disposal sheet had been signed by 3 different deputies, none of whom remembered signing it. Kyle had told exactly one person about the notebook, his cousin. His cousin's name was Mitch Greer. Mitch had not been assigned to Duke by chance. When Kyle was killed, the sheriff's department had considered rotating Duke to a handler in Roanoke, or even retiring the dog early. Mitch had walked into the sheriff's office, closed the door, and asked, formally on the record, to be reassigned as Duke's handler. He had not told anyone why. He had let them assume it was sentiment. Kyle's cousin, close family, wants to keep a piece of him alive, that sort of thing. That is what the sheriff had assumed. What Mitch had actually been doing for the last 7 months was reading Kyle's notebook page by page in his kitchen at night, with a mug of coffee going cold beside him. He hadn't taken it to anyone yet. He hadn't had enough. A notebook of one cousin's observations against a sergeant with a spotless jacket and 18 years on the force was not evidence, and Mitch knew it. and Kyle had known it, which was why Kyle had been building the file quietly, taking his time, waiting until he had something a prosecutor couldn't wave away. Kyle had not gotten to finish. Mitch had. And in the last 3 weeks, Mitch had found something Kyle hadn't lived long enough to write down. There was a shipping account registered to a mailbox in a strip mall 2 counties over, receiving small padded envelopes twice a month. The account was in a name Mitch had never heard until he cross-referenced the mailbox rental. The name was Corey Underwood, the paralegal, the kid in the blue tie. Mitch had not known until this morning that Corey Underwood was the courier. He had suspected the pipeline went from Halden through somebody in the courts, but he had not had the last piece. He had been planning to spend Saturday sitting in his truck outside that strip mall with a camera. Duke had made it unnecessary because Duke had known Halden's smell. Ray Holden had been Kyle's supervisor. Duke had ridden in the back of Kyle's cruiser almost every shift for 5 years. Duke had smelled Holden 1,000 times, leaning through the driver's window, standing at the shift briefing, riding shotgun on one long weekend when Kyle was training a rookie. Duke did not need to see Holden to know Holden was involved. Duke needed to smell what Holden had touched. Holden had touched that hard drive. Holden had touched every piece of it, every night for weeks, in the equipment room of the sheriff's substation on the east edge of town, sitting at a spare desk with a pair of cheap over-ear headphones on, editing the audio himself. He had not trusted anyone else to do it because he had understood correctly that any technician who heard the original would recognize his own voice. So he had done it in the small hours, alone, with the door locked, and then he had handed the drive to Corey Underwood at a coffee shop 3 days ago, along with an envelope of cash that would not appear on any bank statement. He had told Underwood to bring the drive to court on the first morning of the trial and swap it with the drive already logged into the defense's evidence binder. A swap that would go unnoticed because both drives looked identical and because Marissa Vance, the defense attorney, was in on it up to her eyebrows. Vance was not defending Kellner because she believed he was innocent. She was defending Kellner because Holden was paying her quietly through a shell company that on paper existed to do legal consulting for a construction firm that no longer built anything. Vance was going to lose the case on purpose. She was going to lose it well enough that no one on appeal could argue incompetent representation, but she was going to lose it. Kellner was going to prison. Holden was going to keep his badge. The pipeline was going to keep flowing. That had been the plan. The plan had a hole in it, and the hole was named Duke. By 11 o'clock that morning, Corey Underwood was in an interrogation room in the basement of the Hargrove County Courthouse, and his hands were shaking so badly that the deputy across the table pushed a paper cup of water toward him and told him gently to breathe. "Son," the deputy said, "the smart move here is to talk fast, because I promise you, the man you've been running errands for is not going to hesitate to make you the fall guy." Corey looked at the deputy. Corey looked at the door. Corey looked at his own hands. Then Corey Underwood, 26 years old, second-year paralegal, engaged to a nursing student named Bethany, started to cry, and he started to talk. The name he gave first was Marissa Vance. The name he gave second was Sergeant Ray Holden. The name he gave third, and this one made the deputy stop taking notes for a moment, was Assistant District Attorney Colin Prewitt, because the pipeline had not stopped at the sheriff's department. The pipeline had reached inside the prosecutor's office too. Judge Maddox learned this at 11:42, when the deputy in the interrogation room called upstairs, and the clerk carried the message into chambers on a folded slip of paper. Maddox read the paper. He set it face down on his desk. He removed his reading glasses, folded them, and put them in his pocket. Then he sat perfectly still for a full minute. Then he picked up his phone and called the office of the state attorney general. By 1 in the afternoon, 3 state investigators were driving south from Richmond in an unmarked sedan at a speed that would have earned a citizen a ticket in 3 counties. By 2:30, They were sitting in Maddox's chambers with the door closed, listening. By 3:15, they had a plan. Sergeant Ray Holden was still on shift. His cruiser was parked at that moment in the lot behind the Cedarbrook substation, and he was inside the building at his desk, pretending to file paperwork. He had been trying for over an hour to reach Corey Underwood by phone. Underwood's phone was, of course, in an evidence bag. Holden had also tried Marissa Vance. Vance's phone was in the deputy's hand at the courthouse door. Holden had begun to sweat through his uniform shirt, and he had begun to think, seriously, about how far his personal vehicle could get on a tank of gas. He did not know that his personal vehicle, parked at his home on the north side of town, had been under quiet surveillance since noon. He did not know that his wife had been visited gently at her workplace and asked to please not go home until she heard from the officers again. He did not know that his teenage daughter had been picked up from school by her grandmother at Elena Renfrew's request and taken to Elena's house for the afternoon. Elena Renfrew, Kyle's widow, the woman who had spent 7 months believing that Brian Kellner had killed her husband, and who was now sitting in her kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, listening to a state investigator explain, as gently as anyone can explain such a thing, that the man who had killed her husband was the same man who had come to her home the day after the shooting and hugged her on her front porch and cried on her shoulder, and told her he would personally see to it that Kyle got justice. Elena set her tea down. She did not scream. She did not cry. She looked at the investigator, and she said, in a very flat voice, "You are going to arrest him today, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "I want to be there." "Ma'am, I want to be there. I will stay in the vehicle. I will not interfere. I want to see him in cuffs." The investigator, who had a wife of his own and 2 daughters, thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, and then he nodded. At 4:10 in the afternoon, Sergeant Ray Holden walked out of the substation, headed for his cruiser. He was in his uniform. He had his weapon on his hip. He was carrying a small duffel bag that had not been in his hand when he'd arrived that morning. He never reached the cruiser. The unmarked sedan that pulled into the lot in front of him held 2 state investigators and Mitch Greer. The second vehicle, an SUV that pulled in behind him, held Sergeant Ida Delacourt and Duke. Holden's hand moved toward his sidearm for a fraction of a second, and then, because he was not a stupid man, and because he could count, his hand kept moving upward, past the holster, and settled on the back of his own neck. He looked at Duke through the open back window of the SUV. Duke was staring at him, not growling, not barking, just staring, with the same particular stillness he'd worn on the courthouse steps that morning. The investigators cuffed Holden without a word. They took his weapon, his badge, his phone, his radio. They read him his rights, standing in the parking lot in the low autumn sun, while a small crowd of deputies gathered at the back door of the substation and watched, silent, most of them not knowing yet what was happening, some of them beginning to guess. In the passenger seat of the second unmarked vehicle, parked at the far end of the lot, Elena Renfrew watched through the windshield. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was completely still. When they walked Holden past the vehicle on the way to the transport car, Elena rolled down her window. Holden turned his head. Their eyes met. Elena did not say anything. She did not have to. Holden looked away first. That evening, Judge Thomas Maddox sat in his chambers with the door closed and a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. On his desk lay 4 folders. The first was the arrest report on Sergeant Ray Holden. The second was the arrest report on Assistant District Attorney Colin Prewitt, taken into custody at his home at 5:45 p.m. His wife standing in the foyer with a hand pressed to her mouth. The third was the arrest report on Marissa Vance, taken from the courthouse to the county lockup by way of the back door because Judge Maddox had ordered the front door closed to press for the day. The fourth was the order releasing Brian Kellner from custody. Kellner had walked out of the courthouse at 6:32 p.m., wearing the same grey suit that didn't fit him at the shoulders, his hands finally free. His mother had been waiting on the steps with her rosary still crushed in her fist. She had not said anything when she saw him. She had walked to him, and she had pressed her forehead against his chest, and she had stayed like that for a long time, and Kellner had put both his hands on the back of her head as though he was afraid she might disappear if he didn't hold on. A single reporter had asked him for a statement. Kellner had said, "Ask the dog." Then he had walked with his mother to the parking lot, and he had gotten into her car, and they had driven home to a small house on a street where every neighbor had spent 7 months believing he was a cop killer. None of those neighbors were going to sleep well tonight. Duke, meanwhile, was lying on the passenger seat of Mitch Greer's truck, taking up more space than a Belgian Malinois ought to, chin resting on Mitch's thigh as Mitch drove out of Cedarbrook and up the 2-lane road that climbed into the low hills west of town. Kyle Renfrew was buried in a cemetery on that road, a small stone, flat to the grass, with his name and his dates and the words, "In service, always." Mitch had not visited the grave since the funeral. He had not been able to. He had told himself each of the 28 weekends since that he would go the following Sunday, and every following Sunday he had found a reason not to. Tonight he pulled into the small gravel lot at the cemetery gate, and he put the truck in park, and he sat there a moment with his hand on Duke's flank. "Come on, buddy," he said. "You should be the one to tell him." Duke jumped down from the truck without needing a lead. He walked ahead of Mitch through the low iron gate, up the gravel path, past the same rows of stones and small flags they had walked past at the funeral, and he stopped at Kyle's grave without being told, and lay down on the grass with his chin on the stone. Mitch stood beside him for a long time. "We got him," Mitch said eventually, and he was surprised to find that his voice was steady. "We got all of them. Duke did it, cousin. Duke sat down on the courthouse steps this morning and refused to move, and by tonight there's 4 folders on Maddox's desk, and one of them has your killer's name on it, and it's not Kellner's." He crouched down. He put his hand flat on the stone beside Duke's head. "Ray Holden," he said. "It was Holden. All the times you thought it was, it was." Duke did not move. His eyes were open, and he was breathing steadily, and after a moment he shifted his weight so that his shoulder was pressed against the base of the stone, and he stayed like that as the sun went down behind the ridge and the last of the fog came back up out of the valley below. But the story did not end there. It could have ended there. If this had been a smaller story, a simpler one, that quiet moment in the cemetery would have been the last scene, and Duke would have gone home to Mitch's small house on the edge of town and slept on the rug beside the wood stove, and the town of Cedarbrook would have absorbed the news slowly, the way small towns absorb news, and by winter the whole thing would have become a story told at the diner on Route 9 when the coffee ran late. But there was a 5th folder that Judge Maddox had not yet opened. The 5th folder had arrived at the courthouse at 4:45 that afternoon, hand-delivered by a woman named Delia Marsh. Delia Marsh was 58 years old, worked as a school bus driver for the Hargrove County Schools, and had been a widow for 9 years. She had not gone to the courthouse to speak to Judge Maddox. She had gone to speak to the district attorney's office. When she had learned in the lobby that Assistant District Attorney Colin Prewitt had just been arrested, she had turned around and walked to the courthouse and asked to see the judge in person, and Vassar had known her, because Vassar knew everybody, and Vassar had walked her upstairs personally. Maddox opened the folder now at nearly 9 o'clock at night, with his robe hung on the back of the door and his sleeves rolled up. Inside the folder was a single item, a homemade DVD in a plain white sleeve. Attached to the sleeve, with a paperclip, was a handwritten note. The note read, "My grandson Tyler drives the road home from work on Route 9. On the night Officer Renfrew was shot. Tyler was coming up behind the traffic stop, and his dashboard camera was running because he'd had a fender bender the week before, and I made him keep it on. He was too scared to bring this to anybody, because a man in a uniform stopped him on the road 2 days later and told him if he ever said anything about what he saw that night, his mother would lose her nursing license, and I would lose my school bus route. Tyler is 22 years old, and he has not slept properly in 7 months. He's at my kitchen table right now, and he's ready to talk to whoever needs to hear him. My phone number is on the back of this note. Delia Marsh. Maddox turned the note over. The phone number was written in the same careful, slanted hand. He picked up his phone. He called the number. Delia Marsh answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Marsh," Maddox said, "this is Judge Thomas Maddox. I have your grandson's disc. I have not yet watched it. Before I do, I would like to ask you a question. The man in uniform who threatened your grandson, was his name Ray Holden?" There was a long pause on the line. "No, sir," Delia Marsh said. "It wasn't." Maddox closed his eyes. "Was it a deputy or a sergeant?" "He said he was a deputy. He was young, thin, blonde. Tyler said he had a scar above his lip, like a cleft palate that had been fixed a long time ago." Maddox opened his eyes. He knew that face. He had signed a search warrant application submitted by that deputy less than 3 weeks ago. The deputy's name was Wyatt Coldren. Coldren was 28 years old, 3 years on the department, and had been assigned to Sergeant Holden's shift for the past 18 months, which meant that the pipeline had not been 3 men and a paralegal. It had been at least 4 men, a paralegal, and possibly more. Judge Maddox set the phone down. He looked at the DVD in his hand. He walked to the small television at the back of his chambers, the one his clerk had installed years ago for reviewing evidence in complicated cases, and he slid the disc into the player. The screen came up grey, and then a road came into focus. Route 9 at night, wet with light rain, the yellow line unrolling in the headlights, timestamp in the lower right corner, 11:06 p.m. A voice, young and slightly nasal, could be heard humming along to a song on the radio. At 11:08 and 42 seconds, the dashboard camera caught the taillights of a tan sedan, pulled over on the shoulder ahead. Behind the sedan was a Hargrove County Sheriff's cruiser, its emergency lights on, its driver's door open. Standing between the two vehicles was Officer Kyle Renfrew, one hand raised, palm out, in the universal gesture of "hold on, stay in your car." The young driver of the tan sedan, Brian Kellner, was visible through the sedan's rear window, hands on the steering wheel, exactly where he should have been. At 11:09 and 11 seconds, a second cruiser pulled up behind Kyle's. This one had its lights off. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. In the low light and rain, the figure was hard to make out clearly, but the shape and the stride and the shoulders were Sergeant Ray Holden's. At 11:09 and 24 seconds, Holden approached Kyle. Their voices were faint under the sound of the rain and Tyler Marsh's car engine, but the shape of what was happening was clear. Holden was gesturing. Kyle was shaking his head. Holden was gesturing again, more sharply. Kyle was reaching for the notebook clipped to his belt, the red notebook, the one only his cousin Mitch knew about, the one Holden must have realized existed the moment Kyle went for it. At 11:09 and 41 seconds, Holden's hand went to his sidearm. At 11:09 and 43 seconds, the muzzle flashed. At 11:09 and 44 seconds, Kyle Renfrew hit the pavement. At 11:09 and 48 seconds, Holden crossed to the tan sedan, opened the driver's door, and dragged a stunned, completely uninvolved Brian Kellner out onto the wet asphalt at gunpoint. He shoved Kellner face down beside Kyle's body. He then walked back to his own cruiser, retrieved a second sidearm, a small pistol, the kind that would later be described as a throwdown, and pressed it into Kellner's hand, while Kellner was still too shocked to resist. At 11:10 and 17 seconds, Holden picked up his radio and reported an officer down. Judge Maddox stopped the disc. He sat down in his leather chair. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to his desk, picked up his phone, and called the State Attorney General's office again. By 10 the next morning, Deputy Wyatt Coldren had been arrested at his apartment, still in his boxers, in the presence of a state investigator and 2 federal agents who had by then been called in because the pipeline that Kyle Renfrew had begun to sketch in a $1 red notebook had turned out to be, as pipelines almost always do, larger and older and further reaching than any single deputy or judge had first understood. Painkillers were only part of it. There was also a cash skimming operation running out of the property room's civil forfeiture account. There was a car auction fraud running through a used lot in the next county over. There was a small, quiet arrangement with a bail bondsman in Roanoke that had been going on for 6 years and had cost the county roughly $1.4 million in unaccounted for revenue. By the time the state and federal investigators finished pulling the thread, over the following months, 11 people would be indicted. Sergeant Ray Holden, Assistant District Attorney Colin Prewitt, Defense Attorney Marissa Vance, Paralegal Corey Underwood, who received a substantially reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, Deputy Wyatt Coldren, 3 additional deputies from the same shift, a dispatcher who had been quietly rerouting certain calls, a bookkeeper in the sheriff's civilian staff, and in the largest single shock to Cedarbrook, the mayor of the town himself, a genial silver-haired man named Frank Osley, who had spent 21 years shaking hands at pancake breakfasts and had, for 11 of those years, been receiving a monthly envelope in exchange for making sure certain contracts and certain permits went to certain firms. Cedarbrook was going to spend a long time cleaning house. But the person who felt the change first, and felt it most, was Elena Renfrew. Elena was 39 years old. She had been married to Kyle for 11 years. They had 1 child, a 9-year-old boy named Isaac, who had been sitting on the front porch waiting for his father to come home the night the sheriff's chaplain had knocked on the door. Isaac had not cried at the funeral. He had not cried at any point in the 7 months since. He had gone very quiet and he had stopped drawing, which was a thing that had frightened Elena more than the not crying, because Isaac had always drawn spirals in the margins of his homework, elaborate cities on the back of church bulletins, cartoon versions of Duke on every birthday card he had ever made his father. The day after Holden was arrested, Elena drove Isaac to Mitch Greer's house. Mitch met them at the door. Duke was already at Mitch's heel, ears forward. Isaac stood on the porch and looked at Duke. Duke walked forward, past Mitch, past Elena, and stopped exactly 1 foot in front of Isaac. He looked up at the boy. Isaac looked down at Duke. Then Duke lifted his front paw very deliberately and set it on the toe of Isaac's sneaker, exactly the way, 3 years earlier, he had set his paw on a 3rd grader's sneaker in the West Cedarbrook Elementary Gymnasium. Isaac made a small sound in his throat. He crouched down. He wrapped both arms around Duke's neck. He cried for the first time in 7 months. Duke stood perfectly still. Elena watched from the porch step with her hand pressed against her mouth, and Mitch watched from the doorway with his hand on the frame, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say. That evening, on Mitch's kitchen table, Isaac drew a picture. It was the first drawing he had made in 7 months. It showed a courthouse, square, gray, with the American flag on a pole, and standing on the top step was a dog with pointed ears and a broad chest, and behind the dog, walking through the door, were 2 policemen. One of them was Mitch. The other one, drawn a little taller, a little brighter, with a small yellow halo added in the top corner as a shy afterthought, was Kyle. Isaac slid the drawing across the table to Mitch. He did not say anything. He did not have to. Mitch pinned the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a fire truck. It is still there. The trials, Haldens, Prewitts, Vances, Coldrens and the rest took 18 months to work their way through the courts because those trials had to be moved to a different county, because half the population of Hargrove was either a witness or a potential juror or a personal friend of somebody involved. Judge Thomas Maddox recused himself from all of them. He did not want anyone, ever, to be able to argue that his ruling on the morning Duke sat down on the courthouse steps had been influenced by anything other than the plain evidence in front of him. Ray Holden was convicted of the first-degree murder of Officer Kyle Renfrew, of tampering with evidence, of conspiracy to commit fraud, of trafficking a controlled substance, and of witness intimidation. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He did not speak at his sentencing. He was allowed one item to take with him into the Virginia State Correctional System, a photograph of his daughter. He asked for it, and it was granted, and that was the last small mercy he was ever going to receive. Assistant District Attorney Colin Prewitt was convicted of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and accepting bribes. He was sentenced to 22 years. Marissa Vance was convicted of witness tampering, obstruction, and legal fraud. She was disbarred and sentenced to 14 years. Her final motion, a request for house arrest on the grounds of a heart condition that her own doctor had not diagnosed, was denied by the trial judge with 2 sentences from the bench that would be quoted later in Virginia bar journals. Counsel, you built a career on the presumption that words could bend the truth to protect the guilty. This court is not persuaded that your heart is any weaker than your character. Corey Underwood served 4 years and was released on the condition that he complete his community service by working with an addiction recovery program for young men in Roanoke. He married Bethany, the nursing student, on a Saturday afternoon in a small park in a small town with 15 guests, one of whom was Mitch Greer, who came because Corey had asked him to and because Mitch had decided that mercy, given carefully, is not the same as forgetting. Deputy Wyatt Coldren received 19 years. The mayor received 28. Brian Kellner sued the county. He won. He received a settlement that would allow his mother to stop working 2 jobs and would allow him to open the small motorcycle repair shop he had been trying to open for 6 years before the wrong tan sedan on the wrong stretch of Route 9 had put him in the wrong place at the wrong time. His shop, which he named Second Chance Cycles, opened on a Saturday morning in April, and Elena Renfrew was there, standing in the front row of the small crowd of well-wishers, because Elena had asked to be there, and Brian had said yes without hesitation, because whatever else had happened, they had both spent 7 months as prisoners of the same lie. Elena hugged Brian on the sidewalk outside the shop. She said, "Kyle would have liked you." Brian said, "I wish I had known him." Elena said, "You know his dog, that's the same thing." Duke was in the truck across the street, watching through the open window. Judge Thomas Maddox retired 11 months after the trials concluded. He was 63 years old. He did not retire because he was tired, or because of any pressure, or because of any scandal. No one had ever, at any point, suggested Maddox had known any part of the pipeline. He retired because on his last day at the bench, sentencing the second to last of the corrupt deputies, he had looked out over the courtroom and realized that the desk in front of him no longer felt like a place where he was serving. It felt like a place where he was performing, and Thomas Maddox did not want to spend the last chapter of his career performing. At his retirement dinner, held in the back room of the diner on Route 9, because Maddox had insisted on a place that served pie, he was given a small, ceremonial plaque and a much larger, uglier trophy from the sheriff's K9 unit that consisted of a chunk of the actual courthouse steps, a piece of marble roughly the size of a paperback book, mounted on a wooden base with a small brass plate that read, "Presented to the Honorable Thomas Maddox in gratitude for his willingness On the morning of a certain October the 14th, to listen to a dog. Maddox laughed until his eyes watered. Then he cried a little. Then he laughed again. Duke was there, of course. He had been given the seat of honor at Maddox's right hand, and he had spent the entire dinner with his chin on Maddox's knee, accepting exactly one small piece of ham that Maddox slipped him under the table when he thought nobody was looking. Everybody was looking. Sergeant Ada Delacourt, who had been promoted to lieutenant 6 months earlier, gave the toast. "To Kyle Renfrew," she said, raising her glass, "who taught this dog everything he knew." "To Kyle," the room answered. "And to Duke," Delacourt added, "who knew a little more." Mitch Greer was promoted to sergeant himself the following spring. He was reassigned to the K9 unit full-time, and he continued as Duke's handler until Duke's retirement, which came on a warm Friday afternoon in June, 2.5 years after the morning at the courthouse. Duke was 10 years old by then. His muzzle had gone grey. His hips were beginning to ache in the mornings. He could still, when he chose to, jump into the back of the cruiser without help, but Mitch had noticed him hesitating in the last few weeks, one paw up, thinking about it, and Mitch had decided, one Sunday night on his back porch, with a beer in his hand, that Duke had done enough for the state of Virginia. Duke's retirement ceremony was held on the same courthouse steps where he had sat down and refused to move. Judge Maddox came out of retirement for a single day to preside. Elena Renfrew was in the front row. Isaac Renfrew, 12 years old now, taller than his mother's shoulder, was standing beside her. Brian Kellner and his mother were in the second row. Lieutenant Delacour was there in her dress uniform. Corey Underwood, in the back, quiet, unnoticed by most, was there with Bethany, who was pregnant with their first child. Mitch stood at the top of the steps in his dress uniform, with Duke sitting at his heel. He gave a short speech. He was not a man built for speeches. He had written it out on a note card the night before, and he read it slowly. "Kyle Renfrew was my cousin," Mitch said. "He was my friend. He was the best partner this dog is ever going to have. On the night Kyle died, Duke was in the back of that cruiser with the windows up, and there are people who will tell you Duke didn't do his job that night. Those people are wrong. Duke did his job. Duke smelled it. Duke knew. Duke is known for 7.5 years, and everything Duke has done since he lost Kyle has been about finishing what Kyle started." He paused. He looked down at Duke. Duke was looking up at him. On a certain morning in October, on these steps, Duke sat down and refused to move because he smelled the man who killed his partner on a piece of evidence in a bag. Duke could not testify in a courtroom. Duke could not point at a defendant. Duke did the only thing a dog can do. He said no. He said not one more step. He said not one more lie. He said, "This ends here." Mitch looked up at the crowd. "Duke," he said, "has said no. Now Duke gets to say yes. Yes to a warm rug in front of a wood stove. Yes to a bowl of the good food twice a day. Yes to sleeping in on Saturdays. Yes to belly rubs from a kid named Isaac who is going to be his new best friend." The crowd on the steps laughed. Isaac Renfrew, in the front row, was crying openly and grinning at the same time in the way only a 12-year-old can. "Duke," Mitch said, "you're going home with Elena and Isaac tonight. You've earned that." There was a stunned silence, and then Elena's hand came up over her mouth, and Isaac made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and Duke's ears came forward, and he looked at Mitch. And Mitch nodded once, and Duke walked slowly and deliberately down the courthouse steps, past the flagpole, past the maple that was still 6 months from turning orange, and stopped at Isaac's feet. Isaac dropped to his knees on the courthouse walkway and wrapped both arms around Duke's neck, and Duke stood perfectly still, chin on the boy's shoulder, tail wagging in slow, contented sweeps. Elena Renfrew looked up at Mitch Greer on the top step and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Mitch pressed one hand flat against his own chest, over his heart, in the small, silent gesture of "You're welcome" that policemen use when they don't trust themselves to speak. The fog was lifting off the courthouse steps. The morning was opening wide and quiet over the town. Duke, Belgian Malinois, 7 years on the force, 212 arrests, 3 department commendations, and 1 final refusal to move that had blown the roof off a small Virginia county, walked with Eleanor Renfrew and her son toward a station wagon parked in space number 12 beside the maple tree. In the same spot, Kyle Renfrew had parked his cruiser every working morning of his life. Duke jumped into the back seat without hesitation, and he did not look back. He had already done his looking back. He had done it once and for all, on a certain morning in October, on a set of courthouse steps in a small mountain town, when the fog was slow to lift and a man in a blue tie made the mistake of thinking that a dog can only see what a dog can see. Duke had seen more than that. Duke had always seen more than that. And in the end, on those same steps where he had refused to take a single step forward until the truth walked out the door with him, Duke got to walk down them at last, slowly, easily, without a leash, without a badge, without a partner in a cruiser waiting on him, because his partner was riding home in the back seat of a station wagon with him now, in the shape of a boy who had finally, for the first time in a very long time, started to draw again. If this story touched you, leave a like. Tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you when it's ready. Because there are more stories like Duke's out there than any of us want to admit, and the only reason any of them ever get told is because somebody, somewhere, refused to move.